Okay, we are moving to chapter 22 on the lymphatic system and immunity. I'm going to make two lectures, one to cover lymphatic system, which is actually very easy, and a second one to cover main points of immunity, which is a tough one. Okay, you probably already know that your lymphatic system's job is to protect you. It obviously has lymph nodes. You can see a picture of lymph nodes here, the little green dots everywhere. They have phagocytic cells in there, and the phagocytic cells remove bacteria and viruses and blah, blah, blah. Alright, so you already know that. But there's another important function, maybe even more important than host resistance for the lymphatic system, and that is it drains fluid from the tissues. You see all these vessels on the picture. These are little lymphatic vessels. We'll talk more about them in a bit. They drain fluid that has leaked out of the blood vessels, that is plasma that is leaked out, and it picks up that fluid into these vessels. And then eventually the vessels will circulate around the body and dump their stuff back into the blood. We'll talk about that more in detail. So the function then is to keep water in the body, to balance fluid. So remember that we've already talked about this. Let me choose a red color here. Okay, so remember that, oops, you've got a blood vessel here, and remember we talked about plasma leaking out, but when the plasma leaks out, it's now called interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid. Alright, so that's the fluid now that's out here in between the cells. Remember, there are cells out here, tissue cells, and that's the fluid around those cells. Now, that fluid has got to be removed because it would cause edema if it stays there, which alters the function of the cells. So this fluid now is swept up. We'll again talk about how it gets into these vessels, and it moves up these vessels. And we get up here, there's a subclavian vein. You can see it in blue right there. And there's one on the left side over there. And that lymphatic fluid goes now into the subclavian vein and into the superior vena cava, where these drain, obviously, and into the heart. And boom, the interstitial fluid now is back into the general supply. So the fluid was plasma that leaked out. It's then called interstitial fluid when it's out and about in the tissues. It gets picked up by the lymphatic system and returned back into the blood. What goes around comes around. I like that. Okay, so anyway, lymph. Lymph is almost identical to plasma. It has fewer proteins in it. Remember, a big chunk of plasma is plasma proteins. You don't have that many proteins in lymph. Okay, now the vessels. One thing you'll notice here is that this is not a circular system like the circulatory system is. Remember, arteries carry blood out of the heart. They become little arteries. They become arterioles. They go into capillary beds. They get swept up by venules and back into the veins and into the large veins, and boom, you're back in the heart. It's a circle. All right. And the heart is pumping that blood around. But in the lymphatic system, it is not circular. It's one-way motion. So in the peripheral areas of your body is the beginning of the lymphatic capillaries. They're called capillaries. They're not a capillary bed like the blood capillaries there. They're called blind-ended capillaries. Let's see. Let me go to the next shot I think might have. Here we go. Okay, so here's a shot of those little blind-ended capillaries. get rid of that. Okay, right here. So here's capillary right there, blood capillary. Here are cells, interstitial cells, cells of the body. And here are some lymphatic capillaries. Now, these are called blind-ended because they start right there. There is no start in a blood capillary. So the tissue fluid out here, interstitial fluid right here, remember it leaked out of the blood vessel and it comes out this way, and now it's out here, and it's now going to get swept up into the lymphatic capillaries. So they're called blind-ended capillaries. Let me go back to the previous page. All right. Now, let me follow the flow up. All right. So we start out at the feet, at the hands, at the skin. Here's going to be a tissue fluid drop in red. And it's moving this way up through these small lymphatic vessels. So you don't have arteries, veins, things like that. You basically have lymphatic capillaries, then they become larger lymphatic vessels that become progressively larger. Along the way they go through lymph node clusters like that, and they get filtered, and phagocytic cells in those lymph nodes clear out bacteria and viruses and debris and blah blah blah. Okay, so let's keep on going. Now notice I'm on the right side of the body, and all the fluid from this right arm, right shoulder, right head, right chest, all of this is coming up this way, and that fluid on that route goes into a vessel right here. There's an arrow on it right there. It's a little green vessel I'm trying to point to. It's called the right lymphatic duct. It's only on the right side. So all that fluid goes into this right lymphatic duct, and that's where it goes into the right subclavian vein. And now the fluid is back in the general circulation. Now on the left side of the body, notice below the waist, pretty much, from the legs, from the arms, from the left head, you've got a different pattern of removal of that fluid. So let's see, let's go up the arm. All right, so we start out in lymphatic capillaries, picking up the fluid, and we get into the larger vessels, and we go through some lymph nodes, and we come up this way, and there is a vessel right there. You can just barely see it. It's in green. It's part of the thoracic duct. Okay, now let's go down to the legs for a minute. Okay, so we've got fluid coming up this way, goes through a set of lymph nodes, bunches more lymph nodes. Okay, now notice that there is like a baggie right over here. It's called the cisterna chyli. A cistern is like a collection container. A lot of people use cisterns to collect rainwater. I'm going to erase all that. It's getting too busy. Okay. This is a collection depot for the lymph coming up from this part of the body. All right, so now it's draining upward, not downward, upward. We're going up this way, and now we're in the thoracic duct. I just got into the thoracic duct right there. There's the arrow pointing to it. And it comes up this way, and it goes behind the aorta and the esophagus. This is the esophagus in pink, and there's the trachea in blue, and the aorta's in red. And anyway, the thoracic duct goes behind all this crap and comes up behind, and there it merges with the vessels coming up from the arm, and now we go into the left subclavian vein. So there's your fluid flow. Let's see. We'll talk more about lymph nodes in just a minute. So let me spend a little bit more time on lymphatic vessels. Why does the fluid move in? All right. Well, first, let's talk about the architecture of the of the cells. Remember in the very tiny capillaries, like this guy right here? This is simple squamous epithelium. You got those flat squamous cells, and they're all kind of end to end to end, and they're flat. Okay, so you can see a couple cells making up that lumen wall. All right, you've got a similar setup over here in the lymphatic capillary. Okay, so there's a lymphatic capillary right there, highlighted. You can see those little flat cells right there. It's kind of hard to circle this with a marker. All right. No, you may or may not be able to notice that there's a kind of a weird setup of the cells. It's almost like shingles on a house. Think about shingles on a house. So the top shingle is overlapping the shingle below it, which is overlapping the shingle below it. The shingles are not set up so they're all meeting each other end to end to end. That's not the way shingles work. Shingles overlap, all right? And that means that it's very hard for the rainwater to come in underneath the shingles unless the rain is coming really hard at a, horizontal or something. Okay, so you've got a similar setup over here. You've got a kind of a shingling effect where you've got an overlap of one squamous cell over another squamous cell making up the wall of the lymphatic capillary. And this means that the way it's set up, that allows the fluid, remember, red, interstitial fluid, little drops out here, allows the fluid molecules to come in between those cells, but it can't go out the opposite way. There is no movement that way, only in. Okay, another thing, now that's telling you why you only have one-way flow into the capillary, lymphatic capillaries, but let's talk more about what's actually moving the lymph. Okay, so let me go down here to interstitial fluid pressure. All right, so here's your interstitial fluid down in here, and as more and more fluid leaks out, remember this is a continuous thing happening from the blood vessels moving out, there's going to be a pressure buildup out here, right, where you have more fluid. Okay, pressure buildup. That's called interstitial fluid pressure. And that difference between the pressure out here in the interstitial area where the cells are and the lower pressure inside of this capillary means that that pushes the fluid molecules in. All right? Second, we actually talked about these other two things in the circulatory system. Compression. Now there's no muscle around these lymphatic vessels, capillaries, like there are little arterioles and arteries, things like that. But think about what's around this capillary setup. There's muscle, skeletal muscle, all over the body, and as you're using it and moving it around, it pushes down on these little on the tissue, as well as the lymphatic capillaries, and it helps to push the fluid in. So that's another thing that's moving the lymph into the interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillaries, and then along through the lymphatic capillaries. Once the fluid molecules get in here, then it has to move along through the capillaries to the next set, to the larger set, and again it's skeletal muscle activity moving around that does it. Okay, then third, there are valves. So in the larger lymphatic vessels, not the capillaries, you don't see any right there, but in the valves, there are going to be one-way valves. And again, the fluid goes right through the valve. The valve is not, flipping and moving the fluid along, but when the fluid is tending to drop back down again, particularly in your legs, the valves close and don't let the fluid drop. So, problems. Well, look at this guy right over here. You've got lymphadenopathy, or lymphedema, actually. And this is fluid accumulation in some of the vessels of the neck. So the fluid is not getting removed from the area adequately. Sorry, that was a kitten yelling. So if the fluid is not getting removed for whatever reason, then you get expansion of the tissue here, causing expansion of the tissue when you look at it. Why would it not be draining properly, or why would you have edema like this? Well, maybe you've got more leakage of plasma than normal, so this whole thing is compounded. Or maybe you've got some obstruction in flow in a lymphatic vessel, which is blocking the fluid moving from here to there. There's a worm disease that causes that. The worms actually accumulate in the lymphatic vessels and clog them up. Those would be two common reasons. Or inflammation. Remember, in inflammation, which we're going to talk about in this chapter, you get way more plasma leakage than normal. All right. Oh, here's a good view showing edema in the leg. They've injected a dye, kind of a red dye, into the lymphatic vessels. I don't know if you notice right here, but look at the outline of this guy's or woman's, I don't know what it is, leg. That isn't, and it's not because this person is overweight. So they're trying to see where the obstruction of the flow is. Okay, so I think we're going to talk about lymph nodes right now. I'm going to have another picture. Well, let me talk about this picture. You'll notice that these lymph nodes are clustered together, maybe 15 to 20 in little sets. They have names. I've circled the major ones in pink. The one up at the top in the neck is called cervical. You see the name on the left. In the armpit, axilla, or axillary nodes. Then right here where the aorta splits into the iliac artery left and right, you've got some sitting over there, and those are called abdominal. Then in the groin area, you see the inguinal lymph nodes. On this picture of one of the models that we have in lab, the heart and aorta has been removed. You can see the lungs there, and there are some lymph nodes over the trachea and the bronchi, and those are called thoracic lymph nodes. So, and there are many more than that, but those are some of the major ones. Okay, we're going to get more into lymph nodes in a second. Okay, so we've talked about things that move fluid into the lymphatic vessel. We've talked about things that move the fluid through the lymphatic vessel into the larger lymphatic vessels, like particularly physical activity and valves. And again, what moves the fluid into the capillary to begin with from the tissue is interstitial fluid pressure. By the way, you got a nice view of that shingling effect of how the squamous cells are set up by the lymphatic capillary here. All right, more on organs and tissues. So, you see a list of organs involved here. Let's start with bone marrow. Bone marrow is the most important because all the white cells we're going to be talking about in this chapter come from the bone marrow. So you see there's primary and secondary lymphoid organs. In pink are the primary. So you see in the humerus there's bone marrow highlighted. Look at the thymus. Again, don't confuse thymus and thyroid. If this person had a heart, it's been removed, but the heart would be sitting right there. Actually, the thymus is kind of sitting on top of the heart. So, remember the thyroid is up in here. Anyway, so the thymus is where maturation of lymphocytes is going to occur for immunity. Spleen, right there tucked in behind the stomach. The stomach is sitting in front of it right there. So the spleen is on the left side. It's lateral and posterior to the stomach. It has a couple of different functions. It's involved in, it's got some blood reservoirs. It's part of the circulatory system very often. I mean, it's a key thing for circulation and filtering. But also it's involved in lymphatic filtering too. It filters blood It's involved in immunity. There are bunches and bunches of phagocytic cells in the spleen. It's very important in immunity. Then you've got lymph nodes. Let me go to lymph nodes and show you. I showed you some of the main ones, but on this picture on the right you see there's bunches of lymph nodes all over the place. So these are clusters of where you find lymph nodes. You got a picture right here, a diagram of lymph nodes. Notice that you can see some valves. Nice view of valves right there. This is the main portion of the lymph node right here. So again, you've got flow inward and you've got flow outward, continuing on along the lymphatic vessel. Here is a node in a dissected cadaver. These lymph nodes are full of lymphocytes as well as phagocytic cells. We'll talk more about those in a minute, or actually in the next section. Okay, then we've got some odd and end things, which is called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Sometimes you see a reference to gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, mucosal-associated lymphoid tissue. The appendix. So let's see, there's not really an appendix on this picture, so let me put in a red thing. Comes off right there from the base. This is part of the large intestine right here. There's the beginning of it right there, the rounded end right there. And the appendix comes in off of that beginning of the large intestine. There's the appendix right there. I'm making it bigger. It's not that big. It's part of the MALT or GALT area. Then you've got various tonsils. You can see some of them up in here. Remember, well, actually, we're going to talk more about that in the respiratory system, but you've got pharyngeal tonsils. Those are the ones that you cannot see. They're sometimes called adenoids. They're way at the back of your nasal cavity, right up in here. Then you've got the ones that you can see in the back of the throat when they're inflamed. Those are palatine tonsils. And then you've got some on the back side of your tongue called lingual tonsils. Those are mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. Then you've got some specialized little lymph node type tissues called Peyer's patches. This histology section is a shot of the small intestine, of the wall of the small intestine. And look at these circled areas in red and blue. They are Peyer's patches, and they're big collections full of full of lymphocytes as well as phagocytic cells, and again, very important in immunity. Okay. So, we're going to talk more about these cells coming up, but let me again point out the key guys in the lymph nodes. Lymphocytes. I'll get into the B and T lymphocytes when we get into resistance. Then you've got bunches and bunches of phagocytic cells, macrophages, which are relatives of monocytes, and dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are more pervasive than the macrophages. These two phagocytic cells, they have two functions. One, they phagocytose, obviously, and they destroy the antigen. The antigen, by the way, is the foreign whatever that is posing a problem. It induces an immune response. Antigen can be bacteria, viral, worm, protozoan, or it could be an antigen from somewhere, something else. Pollen antigen, strawberry antigens. It could be antigens in the form of a kidney that is being given to you. You are the recipient. Well, the person who that kidney came from, they have their own antigens on their cells. You have antigens all over your cells. Remember agglutinogens on red blood cells? Those are antigens, but they're your self antigens. We're talking about non-self antigens. Anyway, that's what these antigen-presenting cells do? They phagocytose, destroy the material so it's no longer any threat, and then they present pieces of the antigen to your immune cells for them to become active and start the immune process.